So thanks for that presentation. Really wonderful. So the next presentation and the next three presentations we are thinking of in a kind of a suite of arguments that first we're going to hear from Indira Lakshmanan, who is a columnist for the Boston Globe, but also, I think importantly for our purposes, the chair of the Newmark Chair of Journalism Ethics at the Poynter Institute. And so she's going to share with us her perspective on trust in media, rebuilding trust in media. And I think that that ties to Ethan Zuckerman's presentation, and after him, Eli Pariser's as well. I think what we're hoping to shed light on is how, as a field, we can help to rebuild and reshape the media ecosystem to create a place for all voices, inclusive and trustworthy. And so I'm going to leave it there for now and invite Indira Lakshmanan to join us.
All right. Hi, everybody. I was so happy after my career, which has been as a journalist all these years, a journalist in print, television, and radio, to get the opportunity to join the Poynter Institute last year in this new role. And it's really because I feel so passionately about the importance of journalism in a healthy democracy. And in the last 2 years, we've felt really profoundly in the United States how that can be under attack, and how when journalism is under attack, democracy is under attack. So my work for Poynter is in the ethics space, but the thing that I'm really, really passionate and evangelist about is trust, and transparency as a way to bolster and restore trust. And Vince was kind enough to ask me to come and talk about fake news and how it has really affected people's feelings about trust, and what our own study that we've done at Poynter about media trust, and what are some of the best initiatives out there to try to improve trust. So with that, fake news is something that, although the term really came into vogue during the 2016 campaign, fake news, as we all know, has been around since the dawn of time. I am sure that cavemen engaged and cavewomen engaged in fake news, and there were probably, cave drawings that said, oh, I really got a woolly mammoth that was much bigger than what indeed it was. So it's not a new thing. What we have seen in the last couple of years is this whole idea of what is new and viral fake news that has particularly spread due to the internet and due to social media. And we know that it can be motivated by money, like those Macedonian teenagers who wanted sneakers. I'm sure you've read all about them, and band equipment. And what they were doing was creating all sorts of wild headlines during 2016 just to get penny clicks so they could buy what they needed. It could, of course, be motivated by ideology and politics, and we see this with the hyper-partisan websites out there. And I want to say, since this is a group interested in science as well, fake news has infected science forever. Probably as long as it has infected politics. And, we know the term old wives' tales. Well, what is that? It's fake news about science and medicine. It can be intended to create chaos. That's what we know now, of course, of Russia's intervention in our election. And it can, of course, be a smokescreen, false information, misinformation, disinformation, to divert from what the real news is. It's, of course, and we all know this in this room, it does not mean real news that somebody doesn't like. And you may have all seen that yesterday the president tweeted that fake news means, parentheses, negative news about himself and the economy and everything. No, I just put this in here because we all know this, but it does not just mean negative news. All right, I wanted to talk about how is fake news created, since we know the motivations. This is a great graphic that was put together by Claire Wardle. Some of you may know about her work for First Draft News. And you can see that it's everything from, the Borowitz report in The Onion, which is satire, and, what are they doing there, all the way down to political influence and propaganda and the elements that are involved in that. And once you sort of know about these, it's a lot easier to identify them. I have to say that I spent 7 years in China as as a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe, and it always amazed me how the China Daily and People's Daily would often put in reports about crazy, outlandish stuff happening in the United States, and I would look at it and I would say, that was from The Onion, and it would say at the bottom, source, The Onion, very seriously, because they didn't understand that it was satire. I think over the course of years, maybe some of those editors did understand it was satire, but they put it in anyway because it made the United States look stupid. But so that, goes back to motivation. Of course, why did this all spread? Since I said fake news has been around forever, and we know that. Social media, not just the internet, but social media has really allowed the spread of all of this, the spread of, good news and great viral content like we talked about earlier this morning. We saw EP Bird, how they've been able to do viral videos for good, but also for bad. It's out there and it spreads, and as we know, people click on things and share them, simply because they either confirm their biases that already exist, or because it's alarming and shocking and it seems like it must be true, or is it true? So that has led to the spread. I wanted to share with you, this is from Craig Silverman, who's the amazing media editor at BuzzFeed, and if you don't follow him, you all should. And he did some great work right after the 2016 election, looking at the top fake news headlines. And what I wanted to point out here, it's everything from the idea that Pope Francis shocked the world by endorsing Donald Trump to my personal favorite, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in murder-suicide. I mean, who wouldn't click on that, right? But I just want to point out what is so clever about these is the websites look like they're real websites, right? ABC News, who wouldn't believe ABC News? But abcnews.com.co is not ABC News. TMZ Hip Hop, not a legitimate site. And the Denver Guardian, it sounds like a real news organization, but it's not. It was one of those fake news mills that many of you may have heard about or read about. NPR did a wonderful story on them. This is Craig Silverman's work looking at the top 20 fake news election-related stories that were shared on Facebook versus the top 20 real news. So, I mean, things like New York Times, NPR, Washington Post. And look at the difference here. 1.4 million more shares, reactions, engagement on the fake news than on the real news. That's really disturbing. In 2017, it didn't stop. I wanted to share with you some of these incredible fake news headlines that are, a lot of them focused on Nancy Pelosi. She seems to be a big target of fake news. And look at this. They're just astonishing, some of these fake news headlines. Right. I mean, I don't even know what to say, but they get clicks and people believe them and share them. And I have to confess that I spend less and less time on Facebook because it's so annoying to see people sharing things that seem to me obviously fake. All right. So I wanted to show you a little bit about how easy it is for all of us to fall for some of these things. So has anyone in here seen this photo before? Okay, only a few of you. So this is, amazing. I saw this picture and I was like, what? Right? So during Hurricane Harvey, a shark in the water next to the my husband is a photojournalist and he was covering Hurricane Harvey. And I was like, oh my God, what is this about a shark? This was shared by a photojournalist. This guy, Jason Michael, is I think a Dublin-based photojournalist. I was like, what is this about? And look at what he got. He got 146,000 likes on this, 86,000 retweets. Well, I thought that looks really weird. And I used reverse Google lookup or TinEye. Some of you may know about those. And I did a screenshot of this image and I dropped it in to Google reverse lookup. And this is what I found. This is the original image. It was taken by a National Geographic photographer off the coast of South Africa. So that's the real shark where he began. And he has been photoshopped. I mean, I'm going to admit he's a big, scary shark. And look, he's bigger than that kayaker. However, he is not, in fact, on the highway in Houston. Neither is he in Hurricane Irma in Florida or everywhere else. He's shown up in every hurricane and natural disaster in the last few years. Kind of amazingly, this shark is everywhere. But it was pretty easy to figure that out. I didn't show it here, but Black Panther, after that movie was a hit, there were so many images that were shared that were supposedly of white people having been allegedly beaten up by black people for going to this movie. They were all fake. I reverse Google searched them, and they were makeup from The Walking Dead. They were people's Halloween pictures. None of them were real, but they were shared virally. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we in the communication space and in media can help counter fake news. And I want to say that a lot of these tips that I'm sharing here, which are, seem kind of basic and intuitive, actually come from science. Because science and healthcare have been working so long in this space of having to deal with fake news, and I'm thinking of anti-vaxxers, Zika, Ebola, AIDS, all sorts of stories that have been out there that are false. Health communicators and science communicators have come up with some tips that we can adopt in the news media, and these include that you need to explain what something is. You can't just say you're wrong to someone. That is not going to sell. You have to actually explain the evidence and why the information you have is correct and the information that they may have from whatever web search they've done is not correct. Fact-checking. This is something we take extremely seriously at the Poynter Institute. We're the home of the International Fact-Checking Network and also PolitiFact, and my colleagues who run those programs do incredible work on fact-checking. They have a program where they're flagging fact-checks through Facebook and trying to make sure that information is accurate and accessible. That's really important. So when the bad information is out there, you need to make sure that the good information is accessible. This is what we're discovering, that teaching verification skills, especially to the young, is incredibly important. When you get people, when they're still young people and formable and influenceable, it makes a huge difference. Poynter and my colleague Wendy Wallace, who is here, is the leader on a project that we have just announced with Google, where we're teaching fact-checking to teenagers, 13 to 18-year-olds. So sort of creating an, I hate to use the word army of, but that's the analogy everyone uses, but creating an army of young fact checkers. So they themselves know how to go online or in newspapers or wherever they find content and know how to check it themselves. And then they are the sort of viral source for teaching other young people how to do that. Evidence. This is really important, and we know this, again, from science communication. Evidence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And you have to remember that people come to their ideas for a variety of reasons. It's not just because they see information and they suddenly say, oh, yes, and I'm going to cling to that idea that vaccines cause autism. Some of this it's ideology that can be based and bred from people's birth, from their home. There's religious ideology, there's the political ideology that's baked in. I want to say you're not going to convince everybody, but if we focus on sort of the middle patches, we can try to convince a lot of people of what is true. And I think being sensitive to the underlying factors that are causing people to disbelieve is important. And again, one of the great examples that I found in science was a woman in Australia who was a huge advocate of home birthing. And throughout the 1980s, she was all over Australian television promoting home birthing. And one scientist in Australia, one OBGYN researcher, reached out to her and basically in a slow and patient and over-the-years way explained why actually hospital birth is safer and how it brings down maternal deaths and child deaths. And over the years, this woman realized, oh my gosh, I have been responsible for contributing to hundreds of deaths in Australia, or even thousands, because of promoting home health births. And she actually changed and came to the other side. She's one of the most effective people in Australia now advocating for hospital births because she used to be on the other side. We see the same thing with fact-checking on political news, that the more that a fact-check involves someone who you would not expect to hear it from, so to hear a Republican saying, actually, Obamacare is the best option we have, is going to be much more convincing than hearing a Democrat say it. And this is really important to me. We have to hold misinformers accountable. So again, in a science context, if it's someone like Dr. Oz, we have to say, no, that is so not right at all. And, call someone out there who is putting out misinformation, and call out the platforms who are allowing people like that to spread misinformation, calling out people like Oprah and television networks who are giving a platform to people who are misinformers. This is really important. I want to share with you, Vince asked me to share the 2017 Poynter Media Trust Survey, which was our first trust survey we did. It came out in December. And I worked with researchers from Dartmouth, Princeton, and the University of Essex who did a terrific job. They used the YouGov platform. For those of you who know, it's something that allows you to actually not only do sentiment analysis, but allows you to track actually where people are going when they study. I want to show you this because this incorporates longitudinal data from the Gallup poll. Gallup is the first organization that started looking at media trust way back in 1973. So they're really the only way that you can look at longitudinal data over time. And as you can see, media trust hit this high in 1976, which I would correlate with the Watergate scandal being exposed by the Washington Post, the Vietnam War, the end of the Vietnam War, largely through the work of the press exposing what was going on. So that's a high point. But don't forget, it was also a time when most people got their news from 3 network newscasts, by the way, anchored by 3 white men. So I think we also have to think about how news has changed. It has fortunately become more diverse in terms of the outlets and the people who are presenting that news. That's really important. One thing about this Gallup poll that has always troubled me is, whose trust are we measuring? And I've always wondered, back in 1973, were we getting a really diverse collection of people, or were we oversampling white people or white men? Certain minority communities have always had a problem with trusting the mainstream news media because we haven't been good enough about going into their communities, telling their stories, and reflecting back what goes on in minority communities. This is controversial maybe, but I want to say that I think part of the reason people are so focused on media distrust now is because it's a lot of white people who are distrusting the media now, and because it's become so partisan and politicized. But distrust in media is something that has existed for a long time. And you can see how this graph is going down throughout the 1980s. Some of this, Tom Rosenstiel of the American Press Institute talks about how this correlates with Ronald Reagan under his administration getting rid of the fairness doctrine in the FCC and equal time, and how that allowed for the rise of partisan cable news and partisan talk radio. And the more that you have certain news outlets saying, don't trust anybody else, only trust us, we're the only ones who are fair and balanced, the more that certain group of like-minded people is going to think that the rest of the mainstream media is untrue. You can see there was bouncing up and down, a real low in 2016. That was the all-time low, and then actually a bump up in 2017, 1 year into Trump's presidency. The black dot is the dot of what we found, which was actually higher than what Gallup found. As you can see, it's incredibly divided by party. The boost that we saw in 2017 in trust in the media was actually all due to Democrats. Democrats now, 1 year into Trump, trust the media more. Republicans trust it less. That's really troubling. That's not the way, we don't want it to be, the lines to be dividing like this. This was one of the most upsetting things to me, is that the rhetoric that the president has used against the press has really sunk in. And as you can see, a large majority of Trump supporters agree with his description of the media as the press, as the enemy of the American people. And not only that, they actually endorse his view that the government should be able to block access to news stories. And again, the troubling thing about that is it's blocking access to which news stories? To news stories that are negative? We found that 25% of the people across the board in our study, so that includes Trump disapprovers as well as approvers, believed that there should be limits, draconian limits on the press, limits on the First Amendment. So if 1 in 4 Americans think that the First Amendment is negotiable, we have a real problem. And we also found that 44% of people, again, across Trump supporters and not Trump supporters, believe that the press is making up stories, fabricating stories about the president more than a little bit. Think about that. So half of America thinks that we're making things up. That is a real problem and a real wake-up call for the media. For more on trust survey, a much more in-depth survey than we had the funding or the ability to do, I highly encourage you to look at the Gallup Night survey on media trust. Jennifer Preston is in the room and she can tell you all about it. You can see it online. It came out in January. It was really in depth. They looked at over 18,000 people, and the sort of highlights to me were that on the positive side, 8 in 10 Americans believe that media is critical and very important to our society and our democracy, but fewer than half, 44%, can identify a news organization that they believe is objective. And the Gallup Night poll also, endorsed and validated what we found, which is that party is an incredibly significant predictor of whether you're going to trust. And this was one thing that came out in our study, which really was disturbing to me. When you look at the Democrats, the more informed Democrats, the more access they have to media, the more they know about current events, the more they trust the media. On the Republican side, it's the opposite. Republicans who are highly informed, highly exposed to media, and who know a lot about current events, they are the ones who are least likely to trust the media. And we're talking about down to like 17% levels. This is really bad, and you can find out a lot more by looking at the Night study. All right. I wanted to show you this because I just came from the PBS annual meeting where I was talking about trust. I'm on the PBS Editorial Standards Committee, and we've spent the last year reworking and revising editorial standards for PBS, which will be coming out soon. And I love this because from their study, not only are they the most trusted media source for like 18 years in a row, but look at that. I mean, they are way above everybody in terms of trust. And this is for the news and public affairs programs. Now, some people say, well, PBS is so trusted because they have Big Bird and they have Downton Abbey and they have this glow effect from all the other great stuff on their channels. And they have people like General Stanley McChrystal writing op-eds in the New York Times about don't cut funding for PBS because of Big Bird. That is all true and that is all great. And, I think PBS has the advantage of being like the youngest American's favorite channel. I have kids who just are obsessed with PBS Kids, and also the oldest American's favorite news channel because of Masterpiece and things like that, and Antiques Roadshow. But it's not just the afterglow effect. I think that what you see from PBS NewsHour and Frontline and some pieces from POV, I know there's someone from POV here, is, an in-depth approach to news, a sort of an even-handed tone, and a lot, a sort of an endorsement of expertise, which has really, unfortunately, diminished in a lot of the media space, and I think that shows. I want to talk about what some of the building blocks are for trust in media, and these are sort of basic things, basic principles. Editorial independence is the sort of, I would say, foundational stone for your media policies, and that means explaining your policies too. Fairness. I sort of bristle at the term balance or equal time because I think fairness is truly that. It's about fairness and what is factual, and that does not mean that you have to give equal time to things. Again, in a science context, I know all of you probably get really upset when you used to read articles, including in the New York Times, that gave sort of equal time to climate deniers out of a sense that we had to be even-handed and, give both sides. Well, both sides don't deserve equal time and equal column inches or airtime if one side is factually untrue. And I think that is, again, part of the responsibility of journalists to seek the truth, tell the truth. Yes, you have to be fair and impartial when you approach the story, but you don't have to give equal time to arguments that aren't true. Accuracy, that's, of course, clearly our biggest job. Get it right. undermines everything if you're not. This is where I come into like my evangelism here. I think transparency is so critical to media trust. You have to explain decisions. Why did you decide to cover that story and not to cover something else? I mean, so much of what goes into media is the choice of every day that we as news reporters and news editors sit around and decide what are we going to cover and what are we not going to cover. That's the critical first step. How do we gather news? How do we check facts? How do investigations work? Explaining all of this to people, and I think to try to do it as much as possible within the story, whether it's in a written story, whether it's on the broadcast, is really important. Whenever I talk to people, ordinary, smart people who are not journalists, I'm amazed at the level of misunderstanding of things that we as journalists just take for granted that we do. And one example of this is anonymous sourcing. I always, when I give public talks, someone will, in the audience, get really angry and say, how can you expect me to trust you when you're relying on anonymous sources? Someone is calling you up and you don't even know who they are, and you're printing their stuff. And I'm like, wow, that is not how anonymous sourcing works. You know, it's not like somebody has put a sock over a phone and called me up and told me something, and I'm like, ha, you know, oh yes, I'm going to write that and publish that. That's not at all what anonymous sourcing is. Of course, I know who they are. I've met them. I've vetted the information. My editor knows who they are. I worked at Bloomberg for 8 years. There was a very strict policy that at least 2 editors needed to know who your anonymous source was. And this made us nervous as journalists, but we had to write it down in email and send it to senior editors. Executive level editors had to see who our anonymous sources were. So information is vetted. It's not that we don't know, but we as journalists need to explain who is this person. You know, a senior State Department official who could not, you know, was not authorized to speak because blah, blah, blah. To the extent possible, we have to explain how we got that information. And I think that drawing back the curtain and showing how the sausage is made, if people believe in the process, they're much more likely to believe in the end result, meaning the content. Inclusiveness. This is really important, listening to and reflecting back our communities. And I hope that we're all thinking, you know, not just about restoring trust in people who are alienated from mainstream politics, not just restoring trust of the alt-right, but restoring trust of everybody, including minority communities. This is, again, key. Accountability, acknowledge and fix our mistakes. I just want to show you a few quick examples of things that are being done. Some of you may know Sally Lerman from the Trust Project, and she has created a bunch of trust indicators and is trying to get newsrooms to adopt them. And this is about sort of explaining, putting bugs on stories so that you can see the bio of the reporter. What have they done? How do they know? How are they qualified to do that story? Information about the news site itself. And some newsrooms have already adopted these, and her work shows that it does make a difference, people's trusting of that information, that site, with or without the indicators, that it's statistically significant. This is the work of Joy Mayer from Trusting News, who some of you may know. And I love this because she's highlighted the work here of a small newsroom that has actually reached out and said, you know, to their public, we work hard every day in pursuit of fair, accurate reporting. We are your neighbors, and we've been doing this for 130 years. We're 100% employee-owned. We want to hear from you. And then here, it's their telephone number, not just their website, but, you know, we want feedback. You know, that's a way, talking to your community is a way to get trust. This is an interesting story. This channel in Cincinnati, I think it was, actually did a whole long story after the whole Sinclair broadcasting brouhaha over Sinclair anchors and local stations being forced to read the same script. And they said, that's not who we are. This is how we gather our information. We're independent. And that was really good. This is my favorite example. I've written about this. The Washington Post's now Pulitzer Prize winning investigations about Roy Moore. As soon as I read this first story, it was love at first sight with this story. That's going to sound weird, but let me explain why. Because right here in the story, there was a paragraph that said, it was exactly explaining how did we come to the story, saying we went to Alabama looking for a different story, then we heard about this story, then 2 reporters devoted 3 straight weeks to it. None of these women came to us. We went to them. They didn't know each other. You know, really explaining how the Post got this story. That kind of transparency is critical. I interviewed the editor on all of these pieces, and he said, yes, we did that. I wish we had done even more. Like, they didn't say in the context of the story that we didn't pay any of these women. That's something that would have been really important to say so people understand. As a result of this, they created a new video series at the Post called How to Be a Reporter, which I love this series. And they began with an interview of the two women behind the story to explain how did you do it. The whole thing with Project Veritas, which you guys may be familiar with, how they tried to entrap the Washington Post, was all part of their Pulitzer Prize-winning submission. And what was so great was how, again, they drew back the curtain and explained how they did what they do. So I think I'm out of time, but I would love to get your questions and comments. So I'll ask Vince whether we take any questions now or whether you should just grab me. Okay, so find me throughout the day, and also Wendy, my colleague, and someone is raising their hand. Should I? Okay, I'll call on this one person, and then we'll go. Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm Fernando Monteiro.
Yes.
From Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and I represent the Monteiro Fund Foundation. Foundational Fund. Well, first, Indira, congratulations. Your presentation was much better than the one I watched at SIPA with my wife, Molly Monteiro, and School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And they had a section on fake news, and everybody got into some political discussion, and nothing was, because, you know, politics is something and education is something different. When you debate something in education, you feel enriched by discussing with someone else, and you go home thinking, you know, about that discussion, and you enrich yourself. So I think that's how I feel about your presentation, but I don't want to talk about my feelings right now. Well, first is that the fake news has the role of education. The news in itself has the role of education, and fake news destroy the trust that we have. So at this very moment, I'm speaking my fifth language, because my first language is Portuguese. Spanish came along, and Italian because of my family. Mon français c'est catastrophique, because je oublie tout. So my French sucks. That's what I said. And English, here we are. So language has the role. But how do you see all this discussion of yours, considering the fact that, and that's not fake news, because facts are stubborn things, the fact that in Los Angeles, for example, the most popular radio station is in Spanish language. So we are all here discussing the truthfulness of the news and all the mainstream news, they're all English speaking. How do you see this discussion?
Right. Okay, so I think that it's critical that we include Spanish language and other language, media in all of this. And certainly with the International Fact-Checking Network, we're working all around the world with people working in every language. I don't remember the number of partner countries we have or member countries, but it's all across the globe. So Global Fact, which is the next fact-checking conference that Poynter is sponsoring, is happening, I think, June 20th to 22nd in Rome, and there'll be people from all over the world. So yes, there is fact-checking work being done on news media outside of English in every language. But the fact that the most influential news channel in LA, you're saying, is in Spanish, I'm not familiar with that, but I mean, that's critical, and all languages need to be included in this. And I'm happy to answer any questions throughout the day. Thank you.